It's like similar to being invited to the White House and stealing the silverware.
Coming up on the top 5 reasons you can't blame.
White Americans saw Smith and Carlos as, we're coming to get you, sucker.
Smith and Carlos paid the price. They were essentially extricated from society.
That ball is on the line. It's 5 up there. Michigan can't take a timeout.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Kenny, and welcome to ESPN Classic's Top 5 Reasons You Can't Blame. In this show, we consider 2 men who made a powerful symbolic statement about race in America during the 1968 Olympic Games. 2 men who merely put on black gloves to raise the consciousness of millions of African Americans and all Americans. We will, on this program, count down the top 5 reasons you can't blame Tommie Smith and John Carlos for their Black Power salute. Our reasons range from an unwitting comrade to the very essence of the African-American condition. First, though, let's examine how Smith and Carlos shouldered the burden of a country not yet ready to deal with the strong undercurrent of anger.
The 60s became a very, very turbulent time in race relations in this country. In some respects, 1968 was the worst year in American history.
The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, 39 years old, and the leader of the nonviolent civil rights movement in the United States, was assassinated in Memphis tonight.
Oh, my God. Senator Kennedy has been shot.
68 was the year that Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, Martin Luther King was assassinated. And there was a perception of revolution. There was a perception of rebellion.
There were tensions there that basically had been repressed or suppressed that percolated to the surface for blacks and minorities.
America's cities exploded. You had rioting, you had thousands of cases of arson. I mean, the cities literally were on fire.
All during the summer, there was a talk of black Americans not participating in the Olympic Games as a protest to the social injustices.
And we sat down and we could not come to a consensus as to what to do.
The U.S. team thought that it would make more of a stand and more of a difference by going than by staying home and just being an asterisk in the book.
Among those who chose to make a statement at the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City were American sprinters Tommie Smith and John Carlos. Both were from San Jose State, a college in Northern California.
Smith was from another planet. I've seen him take a baton 15 yards behind a world-class sprinter and just fly by him.
Smith begins to pour it on and forges to the front. He literally flies toward the tape.
Carlos was very deceptive. I mean, he could run fast, but he didn't look like he was going fast.
Easily, John Carlos.
They knew they wanted to make some significant statement. There was this sort of anticipation, what would happen.
Now, what about other things that might happen in Mexico City?
All I can say is you can expect almost anything.
On October 16, 1968, after Carlos and Smith won in separate 200-meter semifinal heats, they took their positions at the starting line for the final.
There's Smith. He usually starts kind of slow, makes his bid in the stretch. Carlos should burst out of the blocks, a strong, hard runner.
When that gun went off, it was phenomenal. John just took off.
There's Questad. It's a good start. And Carlos, as usual, has burst out of the blocks.
Then with about 60 meters to go, 60 yards to go, Tommie Smith turned on what he called his Tommie jets and just...
And here comes Tommie Smith! Smith has done it with his hands in the air.
Later, when Smith and Carlos approached the podium to receive the gold and bronze medals, they prepared themselves for what many would scorn as an unwelcome act of defiance.
What I wanted to do
was make a visual stand and not say a word because I didn't know what to say.
Mrs. Smith came walking down with Smith and Carlos, and she gave them the black gloves as they walked into the infield on the way to the victory stand.
I was so afraid on the victory stand that I could hear wind and noises and not people. When you are so stressed that you don't know where to go, what do? You just stand.
I can remember being in a stadium for other events, and when Tommie and John raised their fist and got real quiet, then the boos started.
I looked up and I saw nothing but animals of different type with fangs, with teeth. And the last word I heard was nigger.
Within 2 hours of the Black Power salute, the head of the American contingent received a message from the high-handed, old-school president of the International Olympic Committee, Avery Brundage.
The next thing I knew, Doug Roby, our president, had gotten word from Mr. Brundage that we had to kick them off the team. Doug Roby went back to Brundage and said, "We're not going to do anything about it. So sorry."
At that point, Brundage went ballistic, and he said, if you don't take them out of the relay and kick them out of the Olympic Village, then we're going to ban the entire United States track and field team from every other event in the Olympics.
Doug came back. They said, Avery is not fooling.
The United States Olympic Committee elected to suspend Smith and Carlos from the team.
John Carlos was even more defiant after the American Olympic Committee ordered him off the American team.
I'm pretty pissed off already with a lot of white people, so leave me alone, okay?
The salute caused such a stir that even Jesse Owens, who in 1936 won 4 Olympic gold medals before a Nazi-dominated throng in Berlin, expressed his displeasure.
I certainly feel that politics has no part to play in any athletic program whatsoever.
There was great intense feeling about it. Part of it was this idea that A, you're embarrassing America, but B, you're desecrating the Olympics.
No one had ever mocked the ceremony.
10 days after Smith and Carlos's actions, a backdraft to the raging controversy was set off by George Foreman's patriotic celebration after he won gold in the heavyweight division.
There he is holding an American flag.
George Foreman became the good Negro, and Tommie Smith and John Carlos were the bad Negroes.
When they put their hands up like that, people are saying this is just another part of that kind of chaos that black anger is bringing.
Smith and Carlos essentially became pariahs from the moment they stepped off the podium. They lost jobs, they had an inability to work, there were death threats against them. They were essentially left to suffer alone, and they feared for their lives.
In a 1967 U.S. News and World Report article, it was written that sports was one arena, quote, where Negroes have struck it rich. Then, after the 1968 Olympics, a Chicago newspaper described Smith and Carlos as, quote, black-skinned stormtroopers, end quote. You've seen and heard the case against the two sprinters. Before we get to the top 5 reasons you can't blame them, let's take a look at the few reasons that didn't make the cut. Muhammad Ali. He set the precedent.
I don't have a mark on my face, and I upset Sonny Lisbon, and I just turned 22 years old. I must be the greatest.
In 1967, 3 years after wresting the heavyweight crown from Sonny Liston, Ali was stripped of his title for taking a stand against the Vietnam conflict.
I will not go 10,000 miles simply to continue the domination of white slave masters.
And not only was he forced to give up his title, his passport was taken. He couldn't box, he couldn't travel. The man was denied the opportunity to make a living. Like Muhammad Ali before them, Carlos and Smith put everything that they had accomplished on the line to express their political beliefs.
Our other best of the rest, Peter Norman, the Australian runner who took second place in the 200-meter race.
Tommie and John's wives had gone to the store to buy black gloves for the two of them to wear. And somewhere in the process, John Carlos had lost his gloves.
Peter suggested that one person take each glove, and on the award stand, they could form a U for unity.
Peter Norman showed what could be done if athletes in particular recognized that they have social and political responsibilities that they must take very, very seriously.
When we come back, Smith and Carlos shatter a long-held myth.
The idea that the Olympics would be anything that's not political is an absolute joke.
We're counting down the top 5 reasons you can't blame Tommie Smith and John Carlos for their Black Power salute. Welcome back. We begin our countdown with reason number 5. Baron Pierre de Coubertin, the French aristocrat, revived the ancient Olympic Games in the late 19th century.
While it is announced as an event of peace and sportsmanship and good fellowship, underneath it, it contains a certain amount of politics that has gone on.
Sports had been political since de Coubertin reestablished the Games in 1896.
It was begun as a way to get French boys in shape to beat German boys in a rematch for the Franco-Prussian War.
The whole Cold War was fought out in the Olympics. It was not demonstrations as much as it was the communists trying to prove the superiority of their system.
What made the salute by Smith and Carlos so disturbingly different was that the two athletes were not acting as part of a national power structure.
When the Germans won a medal at the 1936 Berlin Games, they raised their arms in the Nazi salute. That was okay. What Smith and Carlos did was different. They were showing support for a non-governmental movement. Nazi salute, okay. Black Power salute, not okay.
Tommie and John are just the slaves in some ways, the servants. All they're supposed to do is perform on the field and keep their mouths shut.
We shouldn't blame Carlos and Smith. Politics has always been in the Olympics, whether we want to admit it or to verbalize it or not. And for those who think that it isn't, then you're being very naive.
That brings us to reason number 4. Dr. Harry Edwards, the San Jose State professor, had started a grassroots campaign called the Olympic Project for Human Rights.
We are sick and tired of being treated as subhumans, that we're men and human beings and we're going to be treated as such.
What Harry did was suggest to his students, think about the power that you have, think about what you can do to affect change. And Tommie and John Carlos heard it. They knew they were on a mission.
I would like to see it develop into the biggest movement possible to rid this whole earth of racism.
Dr. King was the first national leader to endorse the Olympic Project for Human Rights.
We support it because this is a protest and a struggle against racism and injustice.
Among the many athletes Edwards inspired to speak out was a world-class sprinter.
Before the idea of my becoming involved in the Olympic Project for Human Rights, I didn't want to get involved. Harry convinced me that, no, you can't be left alone. If you are left alone now, you'll be alone all your life.
As far as patriotism, I think this has not that much to do with patriotism. If it were, we would be treated just like any other human being on the face of the earth, which is obviously we are not.
Harry Edwards is the wick. He is the person with the match. He is the person who makes this happen. And in that respect, none of this happens without Harry Edwards.
When we come back, Smith and Carlos are condemned for being something they aren't.
For a lot of Americans, the Black Panther Party was extremely frightening because they'd never seen anything like this before.
We're counting down the top 5 reasons you can't blame Tommie Smith and John Carlos for their Black Power salute. 2 down, 3 to go. Here's reason number 3. Martin Luther King.
I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Instead of being grouped with the non-violent forces of Dr. King, Smith and Carlos were misperceived as militants, more closely associated with the Black Panthers.
I am a revolutionary.
In terms of the symbolic power of that picture, that was Black Panther to America.
We love our people so much that if the pigs attack us, we're going to defend ourselves rightfully with guns and force.
The Black Panthers were the most feared political organization in the United States.
The Black Panthers were promoting community-oriented needs like food and shelter and schooling. But the imagery of the Black Panthers was so stark that as soon as Smith and Carlos stepped on the podium with just the black gloves, it was enough of an association to the Black Panther Party to create white America's worst nightmare.
If white fear was the result of their action, such was not the intention of Smith and Carlos. They acted in the highest tradition of nonviolent protest.
Martin Luther King, before his assassination in April, said that he was in support of them for taking any kind of stand they needed to take in the Olympics.
Dr. King felt really good about it. It was a nonviolent act. It was a statement of conscience.
The left glove, my teammate John Carlos wore on his left hand, made an arc, my right hand to his left hand, also signify black unity.
John Carlos had on beads, and he said that stood for love and then lynchings in Black America.
John Carlos and me wore socks, black socks without shoes, to also signify our poverty.
You can't blame Tommie Smith and John Carlos for this protest. It was a very peaceful, silent, but profound protest.
That brings us to reason number 2. Avery Brundage, the president of the International Olympic Committee.
Mr. Brundage, a prominent American Negro athlete, has called on American Negro athletes to boycott the Olympics. What's your reaction to that?
That's something no one can understand. Mr. Brundage is a devout anti-Semite and anti-Negro personality.
This is a man who owned the Montecito Country Club in Santa Barbara, which had no Negroes, no Jews need apply.
An early glimpse of Brundage's social views was caught at the Berlin Games in 1936, when he was president of the U.S. Olympic Committee.
2 Jewish athletes, Sam Stoller and Marty Glickman, were slated to run on the 400-meter team that was favored to win a gold medal, and they were replaced at the last minute.
There's always been the feeling that Avery Brundage had a hand in this, you know, that if he didn't order it himself, he certainly expressed his opinions to the coaches of the U.S. team.
32 years later, Brundage, as IOC president, threatened to expel the entire U.S. track and field team from the Mexico City Games if Smith and Carlos weren't sent packing.
Brundage, because he went crazy about this, he actually helped make this a big event.
Think what would have happened if Avery Brundage had not been a fascist and had said, okay, let's move on. We would barely remember.
Our number 1 reason for not blaming Smith and Carlos has become clear in the light of history.
You cheer and you love me, and then when I come back home, you treat me like crap.
Smith and John Carlos for their Black Power salute. Before we present reason number 1, let's recap. Reason number 5, Baron Pierre de Coubertin. Reason number 4, Harry Edwards. Reason number 3, Martin Luther King. And number 2, Avery Brundage. And welcome back. You've seen reasons 5 through 2 why you can't blame Tommie Smith and John Carlos for their Black Power salute. Our primary reason digs down to the very core of the African American condition. They were right. Racism was very much alive in America when Smith and Carlos ascended the podium.
Tommie Smith and John Carlos not only had every right and every reason to speak out and to protest, but they had an obligation to do it.
We can participate in the Olympic Games, but when we go back home, we can't live wherever we want to. We can't ride on any bus. We can't sit at a lunch counter. We can't go to any school.
African Americans were indeed not equal to whites, having to use separate, facilities, separate drinking fountains.
The 1960s marked a time when African Americans were making their voices heard in the streets and the voting booths. By raising their fists in 1968, Smith and Carlos took the movement worldwide.
Black Americans felt frustrated in our lives and had to make the world aware. It seemed like no one cared.
It was a chance to make a statement to the world. We are human beings. If we can come here being the greatest athlete in the world, why can't we be treated the same way when we go back?
If I were going to come back and be classified as a second-class citizen, I wanted my feeling known where I was seen the most.
These young men made a statement not about killing, but about hear us. We have a platform, hear us. Our quest for dignity and defiance must be taken to the world stage. They did just that.
Now, how do you blame these guys for being patriots in their own way? And we're going to hold up our hand and we're going to bow our heads and say, shame on you, America. Shame on you for all the things that have gone on.
During their track careers, Tommie Smith set 7 individual world records, and John Carlos 2. All their marks on the track have since been broken, but their act of courage on that podium has proven much more lasting. I'm Brian Kenny. Thanks for joining us.